Okay. Okay, and good afternoon. Sorry I'm not there with you in person. This would have been great in person because we're going to celebrate Betty White's 100th birthday. Actually, because Betty White is celebrating her birthday in about 2 weeks, last week I didn't have very much to do. And I said, you know, she's celebrating her 100th birthday, and I'm not going to do a whole talk about Betty White, but I could do a talk about the pioneers of television, the women, the people who actually did things back then that are forgotten today for the most part. People like Gertrude Berg, who was with the Goldberg show, of course, and she, just muting everybody here, okay. Anyway, so we have Gertrude Berg here, and of course, Betty White, that was her Los Angeles show on KNBH, the NBC affiliate, way back when in the early 1950s. In fact, it is said Hugh Downs was on TV for more hours than anybody else. But Betty White, she was around in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, turn of the century, in the 2000 teens, and I bet you she'll be on TV during her birthday in a couple of weeks, and that would give her 9 decades on TV. Hazel Scott. Hazel Scott was once married to Adam Clayton Powell, the congressman from Harlem, and they were a power couple back in the day, in the late 1940s. A Juilliard graduate. She was the first woman of color to ever host an American television show back on the Dumont network. Dagmar. Oh, over the years, I've talked about Dagmar in my early days of TV talks, and I had one guy who said to me, he was breathing hard, and I said, "You okay? You okay?" He said, "She was the best breather on TV, the first sex symbol on TV." So it said on Broadway Open House, which was on NBC late nights. The Beulah Show. And Ethel Waters was one of the Beulahs. They were on ABC TV. There were 4 Beulahs altogether during the show's run. Of course, Lucy. Lucy is hot again. Amazon Prime has the Being the Ricardos movie that's out, that played in some movie theaters, that has, you know, it's gotten mixed reviews, some good, some bad. But Lucy has this movie. There's going to be another movie, a documentary about her next year, and she's made a return on radio, on XM or Sirius XM radio. Dinah Shore, See the USA, Drive a Chevrolet. Donna Reed. The Donna Reed Show, first time a woman is a central character making decisions in the family. And by the way, it is said Lucy is a pioneer because she was an executive and all that, produced her show. So did Donna Reed. So did Gertrude Berg, which was rather unusual in the early days of TV because that's the 1940s and 50s, and most women were school teachers, nurses, or secretaries, or worked for Bell Telephone as an operator. Erna Phillips, you probably have never heard of her, but she invented the soap opera, and one of her soap operas is still on the air in 2021. Faye Emerson Show, before there was Johnny Carson or Jack Parr or David Letterman, there was Faye Emerson, late night TV. Martha Roundtree, she was the creator of Meet the Press. Pauline Frederick, who during World War II operated as a journalist in the Pacific Theater, and she was the first woman to be hired by a network as a correspondent. Early TV, even predating the 1940s, 1930s, Chicago. Fran Allison, Fran Kukler, and Ollie. Kukler, Fran, and Ollie at the experimental television station W9XBK. Bill Eddy and his people were just looking for any talent that they could find. And they happened to be across the street from the Chicago Theater, which is still there. Hey, come on my station. I want to see what's going on. I want to put something together on TV. Just come over, come over. No schedules, no announcements, anything could happen. And a guy by the name of Burr Tillstrom was first face seen over W9XBK in Chicago. Tillstrom's Kukler, Fran, and Ollie would become one of the station's first regularly scheduled shows. And that would be a big show in the 1950s, Kukla, Fran, and Ollie. But let's talk about Gertrude Berg. And there is Gertrude Berg, described as the Oprah Winfrey of her time, except Gertrude Berg did a lot more in showbiz than Oprah Winfrey ever did, and she was the pioneer. She was, of course, the brains behind the show The Goldbergs, which started on radio and ended up on TV in 1949. She was born Tilly Edelstein, Tilly Edelstein in New York City in 1898, and rather quickly they found out that she had talent. Tilly's father was a guy by the name of Jack Edelstein, and he was one of the early hotel owners in the Borscht Belt in the Catskills in the 19-teens. So he runs a resort in the Catskills, and Tilly's there, of course, the daughter, and the daughter was expected to work, much like Freddie Roman, who wrote Catskills Over Broadway. His uncle ran a place up in the Catskills, and he worked there during the summer. So Tilly was the first, Gertrude Berg. Eventually, she created and performed skits to amuse the guest children. She would meet an older Englishman, a guy by the name of Louis Berg, one summer at the resort. He wooed her. And when she turned 18, they got married. He was a smart guy. He was an engineer on a sugar plantation until the place burnt down. They moved to New Orleans, and that gave her the opportunity to move back to New York. So Tilly and Louis returned to New York City, and she decides she is going to be a writer, and she's going to be an actress, and she changes her name to Gertrude Berg, taking her husband's last name. And then she starts to write radio scripts about this fictional family called the Goldbergs, a combination of her mother's maiden name and her husband's last name. And the Goldbergs are about a Jewish family in the Bronx trying to assimilate into America. Premieres on radio, 1929, and she's doing the role of Molly. She doesn't intend to be Molly. She's just going to produce the show, and you got to remember this. In 1929, women just didn't do this. They just didn't produce shows, write shows, and sell it to a network. So she was an extraordinary woman at that point. She was only about 20 years old or so as well. So she's doing the role of Molly Goldberg until another actress could be found. And she was good at it. One week, she wasn't well. She was sick. And the public sent in a mass amount of fan mail asking, "Where's Molly?" Well, there's Molly in front of the NBC microphone. In 1936, she signed an incredible deal. 5-year, $1 million contract with the sponsor Procter & Gamble. By the end of the decade, she was making a reported $7,500 a week to produce, write, and star in her own radio series. At that point, she's about 37 years old. I got the age wrong. When the show started, she was 30, actually. But anyway, so she's in this show. During the height of her radio program, she polled second as the second most respected woman in America after Eleanor Roosevelt. Gertrude Berg did it all. She actually was on Channel 1 in New York, which was the station that NBC had at that point, WNBT, Channel 1. And she's doing a live stage version of the Goldbergs on TV. And this is only going to maybe 1,000 TVs, maybe 2,000 TVs in the New York area. But she's considering to do a live stage show of the Goldbergs. And so she performs it on NBC TV. A number of years later, her 1948 play, Me and Molly, made its Broadway debut, but it only lasts about 156 performances, but still long enough to convince Berg that it's time to move to television. Now, nobody knew if television was going to work. In fact, in 1948, the FCC froze the number of licenses that they were handing out in terms of television, which meant some cities didn't have any TV at all. Places like Austin, Texas. The Goldbergs premiere on CBS in January 1949. And it's well received. It's received well by the television audience, and the critics like it. But then again, it's still the same show that was on radio. And there are Gertrude Berg and Philip Loeb, the Goldbergs on TV. And Philip Loeb would become a problem for Gertrude Berg. Gertrude Berg was the lead writer, the star, the producer, and the Goldbergs kept climbing in popularity. Philip Loeb was well liked. In 1950, Gertrude Berg won the first ever Best Actress Emmy Award in history. Well, TV was only about 4 years old at that time. The Goldbergs was nominated for the Best Kinescope Show. Let me explain kinescope for you a little bit. This 1950 is when videotapes, or rather film, was started to be used for television. But a lot of shows were live, and you couldn't capture them on video because video wasn't invented at that point. So what you did was you took a camera, aimed it at the TV, and you filmed the TV. And that's how a lot of people ended up seeing shows, because they were sent to places that weren't connected to networks. They were just couriered out there. So a lot of people saw those shows on kinescope, which, you know, kind of elongated faces, and they look kind of weird. Oh, Gertrude Berg was just not Mrs. Goldberg. She had a clothing line for housewives. She published a cookbook. She wrote an advice column called Mama Talks. Her television show was made into a movie called Molly by Paramount Pictures, with Berg on the set and in the editing room. She was the screenwriter and the producer, and she was looking over the film. But she runs into major, major problems. You know, it's red channels, it's the communist scare, it's outing communists in the movie industry, and also the television industry and the radio industry. The House on Un-American Activities published red channels. The report of communist influence in radio and television. Gertrude's co-star, Philip Loeb, the late Philip Loeb, an active union organizer among actors, was listed. There is red channels, the report of communist influence in radio and television. The sponsors, despite the fact it was a hit show, it's an absolute hit show, but you got to remember, this is in the middle of the Red Scare. Anytime Russia could drop, or Soviet Union could drop a bomb on us being the U.S. China, of course, has gone communist. There's a war in North Korea, which is a proxy war for the Soviets, and the Chinese are involved. So Gertrude faces a great dilemma. Find new sponsorship or fire Philip Loeb, and she has great stage chemistry with him. She appealed to the sponsors, the network, and even New York Cardinal Spellman, who told her, yeah, I could help, but you got to do one thing: convert to Catholicism. She wasn't going to do that. CBS, which had employees take loyalty oaths to the U.S. in 1950, that was what they were doing. Berg resisted the network demands to fire Loeb. CBS and the sponsor, General Foods, canceled the Goldbergs in 1951. She won the first Emmy the year before as the Best Actress on Television. But the show would not go away. It was put on hold for about 2 years. She eventually found a replacement for Loeb, even though she didn't want to do it. First, Harold Stone for one season on NBC, and then Robert Harris. Dumont picked up the show after NBC dropped it, but the Goldbergs' time had passed. McCarthyism and blacklisting won. And she was also blacklisted as a communist supporter through her association with Philip Loeb. In 1955, unable to work and support his schizophrenic son, Philip Loeb committed suicide. Berg was left to deal with a ruined career. By the way, the Woody Allen Zero Mostel movie back in the mid-1970s, I think it was called The Front. Zero Mostel plays a character very similar to Philip Loeb, who was his friend. Meanwhile, Betty White's going to be 100 years old. Life with Elizabeth. Life with Elizabeth. Betty White came up with this idea. And like Lucy and like Donna Reed and like Gertrude Berg, she had an ownership in this thing. Betty White was probably the most prolific female of 1950s television. And yet she was constantly attacked by newspaper critics. Open war was declared on White, who, with her safe, exuberant demeanor, was said to represent everything that was wrong with the medium. During that first decade of television, she was often dismissed as too perky, too saccharine, even vacant. 2022, she's a national treasure. And there is a very young Betty White, 1940s, 1950s. So how'd she start on TV? Well, she started on TV with a guy by the name of Al Jarvis. Disc jockey Al Jarvis saw me on Grab Your Phone, and he asked me, would you like to be my girl Friday? I'm starting a television show, she recalled. Turned out I was going to be his girl Friday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. He was going to be on for 5 hours every day. That's how he did his radio show, and he wanted to do the same thing on TV. He said he'd pay me $50 a week. $50 a week, I was in heaven. The name of the show was Hollywood on Television. We played records, and in between records, we'd talk a little. But while the record was on, the audience would see us moving around and talking to each other because, you know, they're playing the record, and you didn't have to do anything. After the first week, they called in and said, it's driving us crazy. We need to know what you're saying. So they scrubbed the records, threw out the turntables, and we would ad-lib for 5 hours. Well, there was only one other station on at the time, so it was either us or the test pattern during the day. The show was so successful that after 3 weeks, they extended it to another show on Saturday and stretched it from 5 hours a day to 5.5 hours a day. We were on 33 hours a week ad-lib. She wasn't scripted. They had to come up with something every minute of the day. Betty White, Hollywood on Television. Jarvis leaves the show. The show starts in 1948. Eddie Albert took his place and co-hosted with Betty White for 6 weeks until 33.5 hours of live ad-lib television per week, featuring just the two of them, took its toll, and he resigned. And Betty White would become the host of the show alone, and it is believed that Betty White was the first female television talk show host as a result. After a period of White talking directly into the camera lens for hours of the stretch, they decide, you know what, let's do something different. Let's do something totally different. And the show began accepting guests, and they'd have guests on to interact with her, as well as gradually incorporating scripts and sketches, which would lead Betty White to something else. One sketch involved White as a housewife named Elizabeth. Catches on. And it turns into a half-hour sitcom. Well, what's the next step? Get it on TV. Life with Elizabeth. Series pianist George Tibbles began writing the sketches. Studio producer Don Featherson, who would go on to things like My Three Sons. Don Featherson, Tibbles, and White form a production company called Bandy Productions, named after Betty White's dog, Bandit. So you get Lucy, who has her own production company, woman, and Betty White. And White changed over to a half-hour sitcom format based on the Elizabeth sketches entitled Life with Elizabeth, which ran in syndication for 2 years and 65 episodes combined. Then there was the Betty White Show on TV. Here she's pitching Geritol, which actually didn't make you feel strong or fast, but it's kind of snake oil in the bottle. But it was a heavy-duty early days of TV sponsor, particularly with quiz shows. That and sanitary, what was it? Nature, what was that? What it was, which was nature's spelled backwards. Seritin, nature spelled backwards. They were advertising those shows. So Featherson makes a deal with NBC for a 30-minute, 5-day-a-week noontime show. Betty White's going to go national on the noontime show. It would be the second program titled The Betty White Show and her first network exposure. And again, it's a mixture of songs, light comedy sketches, and celebrity guests. She would follow a show called Home, which was hosted by the very popular Arlene Francis, who was also on What's My Line and was an actress and did some radio. The Betty White Show was initially a success. Betty White. We're doing so well at noon. Kids would come home for lunch and mothers would get their work done and they could tune in. And our ratings kept going up and up and up. But you know that old saying, what goes up must come down, and there was a reason the ratings came down. Don Featherson theorized why Betty White had instant appeal. Women like her because she is in competition with them. Men like her because she's kind of the girl that they'd like their daughters to grow up to be. Betty explained to Bob Thomas what viewers could expect. We'll have a nice, easy show, not one of those real fast slam-bang shows that you feel you have to sit there and watch. Women are too busy during the day to do that. They want the kind of show they could look at between chores around the house. Remember, this is the 1950s, although there were more women in the workplace in the 1950s in the United States than at any time before. Okay, what goes up must come down. The Arthur Duncan problem. In the early 1950s, White faced criticism for featuring Arthur Duncan. It's actually 1954, a black tap dancer and singer on a few episodes of her variety show called The Betty White Show. Arthur Duncan would eventually say, I credit Betty White for really getting me started in showbiz. White described that all through the South, the Arthur Duncan problem, there was this whole ruckus. They were going to take the show off the air if we didn't get rid of Arthur because he was black. White said at the time she wasn't going to budge. Evidently, through the South, at that point, it was a very heavy thing. And I said, I'm sorry, but he stays. Live with it. They didn't. NBC started to change the show's time slots, and the show would have lower viewership. By the end of 1954, NBC canceled the series. Betty White would stick to her guns, but Jim Crow won out. Betty White would do other series, of course. She would do the Mary Tyler Moore Show. She would do Golden Girls. She would marry Alan Ludden. She'd be a regular on the Goodson Todman shows, whether they were To Tell the Truth or Password, or the later versions of Password with her husband, Alan Ludden, and The Match Game. So she had a good career in showbiz. But she lost the show because she stood her ground. Hazel Scott. Hazel Scott kind of was the Beyonce of her day, perhaps. Hazel Scott was born in Jamaica, the English colony, and moved to New York when she was 4 years old. She was the darling of cafe society in 1939 in New York City, had that kind of thing. The Cafe Society. Scott captivated audiences with her rendition of classical masterpieces by Chopin, Bach, and Rachmaninoff. Nightly, crowds would gather at Cafe Society, New York's first fully integrated nightclub, the epicenter of jazz and politics down in Greenwich Village to see her. While she was in high school, Hazel hosted her own radio show on WOR, 710 on the dial. It's still WOR. Most of the radio stations from that era that were on in New York, whether it was WNEW or WMGM, WHN, their call letters are long gone. WNBC is another one, or WRCA, but WOR is still there. So she wins a local competition. She's got the radio show. She performs gigs at nights. She makes her Broadway debut in the musical review, Sing Out the News. Commercial recordings of her Bach to Boogie on the Signature and Delta labels would break sales records nationally. She's known. She is really, really very well known. And she's one of the first black entertainers to refuse to play before segregated audiences. They had to be both white and blacks in the audience. She's in Hollywood in the 1940s, and she successfully challenges the studio's treatment of black actors, demanding pay commensurate with her white counterparts, refusing to play subservient roles in which black actors were commonly cast. She would not wear a maid uniform or washerwoman rags. She insisted that her name credit appear the same in all films. Hazel Scott, as herself. And then she marries Adam Clayton Powell, and they become the power couple, the Negro power couple. Hazel began a romantic affair with the Harlem preacher and politician Adam Clayton Powell, who was making a bid for the U.S. Congress. 12 years older than her, they married. She marries. 12 years older than her, he was married. He was a womanizer, supposedly. Powell pursued her unabashedly. At first, she was annoyed by his advances, but eventually, irritation gave way to real interest and passion. The couple began seeing each other in secret. Amidst a great deal of scandal, they married in August of 1945. And Hazel Scott finally hits TV. It's the Dumont Network. It's 1950. And like Gertrude Berg, she doesn't last for the same reason: communism. In 1950, the jazz pianist and singer Hazel Scott was the first African-American woman to host her own TV show on the Dumont Network. The show came to an abrupt end after just a few months, as she's named in red channels, the pamphlet that listed the supposed communist sympathizers in entertainment. Scott chose to testify before the House on Un-American Activities Committee to defend herself. Her husband, Adam Clayton Powell, said, "Don't do it. You're not going to win." Sponsors in Dumont dropped the show. Hazel's association with the Cafe Society, a suspected communist hangout, along with her civil rights efforts, made her a target of the House Un-American Activities Committee. She was neither a member of the Communist Party or a communist sympathizer. She requested to appear voluntarily before the committee. Adam Clayton Powell said, "Don't do it." Her career was ruined. Dagmar, the best breather on TV. Maybe ever. She, like Kim Kardashian, had two assets, and you could see the assets right there. Dagmar, Broadway Open House was the first network late-night comedy show. Jerry Lester and Maury Amsterdam were the hosts, but Maury left the show, leaving Lester as the sole host. A woman by the name of Virginia Ruth Egnar, known professionally as Jenny Lewis, was part of the show. Audience loved her deadpan delivery of punchlines and deliberate misuse of words. In one skit, she appeared as a character named Dagmar, and the name stuck. During World War II, she moves to New York City from West Virginia and finds work as a sweater model. That's what she did. She was breathing in a sweater, and they took pictures of her. And a Broadway actress. The sweater model days served her well. Because of her bosom, she became TV's first blonde sex symbol. As Dagmar, Lewis was instructed to wear a low-cut gown, sit on a stool, play the role of a stereotypical dumb blonde, with tight sweaters displaying her curvy 5'8" figure, measuring, so they said, 42, 23, 39. Her dim, bold character was an immediate success, soon attracting more attention than Jerry Lester. And there is Dagmar. Lewis quickly showed that regardless of appearances, she was quite bright and quick-witted. She appeared in sketches, and Lester made occasional jokes about her hidden talent. In 1952, she briefly hosted her own series called Dagmar's Canteen. She did variety and game shows throughout the 1950s. She drifted out of the spotlight after the 1950s, but would perform in nightclubs. And she was never forgotten by car lovers, because that's the Dagmar bumpers that were on General Motors cars that really didn't fit. The Dagmar bumpers, when they first came out, they were all chrome, but they inflicted so much damage to other cars that they were rear-ended by them, that GM put rubber tips on them to minimize the damage. But the rubber tips gave them a look like they were wearing pasties. Dagmar. The Bueller Show, 1950 to 53. Now, it said Diane Carroll was the first African-American to be a star of the show, the Julia Show. But the show is called Beulah. The first TV show to prominently feature a black character. Beulah was a black maid serving a white suburban family. Beulah was known as the Queen of the Kitchen and dispensed wisdom to the ever-bumbling Henderson family and to her friend Oriole. 3 actresses played the title role: Ethel Waters, who was replaced by Hattie Mcdaniel, and then Louise Beavers, who replaced McDaniel when she fell ill. And there are the three Beulahs, the Beulah Show. Ethel Waters starred as Beulah for the first year of the TV series. She quits in 1951. When the production company goes out to Hollywood, and there were a lot of shows going out to Hollywood because that's where Lucy was in her Desi Lou production, although this wasn't Desi Lou company. Hattie Mcdaniel, the star of Beulah's radio show, was cast in the title role summer of 1951. She only lasted 6 weeks. She fell ill, and she was replaced by Louise Beavers in late 1951. The Beulah Show, like Amos and Andy, came under fire from many critics, including the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which accused the show of supporting stereotypical depictions of black characters, with Beulah viewed as a stereotypical mammy similar to Aunt Jemima. I love Lucy. Do I love Lucy? CBS approached Lucille Ball about doing a weekly program on television in 1950. She jumped at the chance. After all, at that point, she's 39 years old, and yeah, she had success in radio, but she wasn't a star. And that radio show that she had success in was only 2 years worth of success. But CBS wants her. They want her to do a show, and her first requirement for any show becomes a major sticking point. She wants her husband, Desi Arnaz, a Cuban exile, to play her husband on television, possibly to save their marriage. The CBS executive said, no, not going to do it, not going to do it, not going to do it. But CBS and Jello, the potential sponsor, didn't want, there was a reason they didn't want Desi. She's a red-blooded American girl. He's a Cuban exile. CBS and Jello, that sponsored the radio show, My Favorite Husband, that Lucy was coming off, said, let's have Richard Denning on. Don't fix it if it ain't broke. Philip Morris would replace Jello as a sponsor. Lucy wanted to save her marriage, hence working together. And yeah, they were married. They got married in 1940. CBS was told by Lucy that you got to have Lucy and Desi or you can't have either. CBS says, we have some doubts. You know, he's Cuban. Has a strong Cuban accent. Oh, and by the way, they were an interracial or multi-ethnic couple. Well, the problem goes back to 1877. That's Rutherford B. Hayes, President of the United States in 1877, and kind of an accidental president at that. Oh yeah, and Lucy and Desi were married. See, interracial marriage in 1950 was still illegal in parts of the United States. In fact, America's civil rights movement was stalled since 1875. The segregation in the South ended with the Rutherford B. Hayes, Samuel J. Tilden presidential race. Hayes, the Republican, became president after Democrats cut a deal with the Republicans. The Democrats said, get the federal troops out of South Carolina and Louisiana, give us states' rights, and you can have the Oval Office. And that's exactly what Rutherford B. Hayes did. Interracial marriage, at that point, illegal in more than a dozen states. They go on tour in 1950. They show America, hey, this is us. Nobody noticed they were an interracial couple after that tour. In 1951, CBS says, okay, let's do the show. In 1951, they put up $5,000 of their own money to film a pilot, a test show. Everybody likes it. CBS puts it on the schedule. Oh, wait a minute. Before we go on, Lucy has other demands. She wants Carl Frahn to be the cinematographer of the new show. It's going to be before a live audience, but it's going to be in Los Angeles. Can't do that. It's New York and Chicago. No, we're going to do it in Los Angeles. You don't get the show. They did the show in Los Angeles because the show was shot on 35mm film, which they paid for. And CBS has probably said, okay, you're paying for it. Good. Let's do it. Groucho Marx's show was done on film before that, as was your Showtime. The Stu Irwin Show and the Life of Riley, a guy by the name of Jerry Fairbanks, developed the technique of using multiple camera film production for TV in 1950. And Lucy knew talent. Desi was the perfect foil for Lucy. Desi had good comedic timing, expressive face, right amount of fluster as Ricky. He mispronounced Latinized words, adds to the comedy. Lucy's the #1 show in New York within 4 months of the debut, and then #1 in the country. It's a smash hit. Each should go on and on for 5 years until they get tired of playing the roles or they run out of ideas, the writers. Smash it. Lucy and Desi agreed to pay for the increase in production costs provided they, not CBS, owned the rights to the film. Brilliant business move. Nobody thought at the time anybody would watch a rerun. And Lucy and Desi agreed to a $1,000 each per week salary cut. Show was a hit, except it's almost gone in 1952 because Lucy was pregnant. Lucy and Desi having a second baby. 1952 America, considered too racy for a visibly pregnant woman to be on TV. Television had censorship. Lucy and Desi were not allowed to say the word pregnant. Jess Oppenheimer, who is the lead writer and basically the showrunner, comes up with an idea. He's looking at Lucy here. He says, let's write the pregnancy into the show. Hey, a visibly pregnant woman never appeared on stage or television before. Big, big risk. Lucy, Desi, and Oppenheimer from the creative end. CBS and the show's sponsor, Philip Morris, from their end. Storyline worked. CBS allowed Lucy to appear on screen during her pregnancy, and some of the scripts did address the topic. However, the executives at CBS wanted to make sure the episodes wouldn't cause too much of a stir. You can only be half pregnant. Well, you can't be half pregnant. Lucy and Desi survive. According to Lucy, in the early fall, when I was beginning to look pretty big, we did 7 shows concerning my pregnancy. These films were screened by a priest, minister, and a rabbi for any possible violation of good taste. It was the CBS network that objected to using the word pregnant. They made us say expectant. So a priest, a minister, and a rabbi get into a room to watch a show. The 3-man religious committee head off protest. What's wrong with being pregnant? According to Lucy, they were hardly in favor of what we were doing, showing motherhood as a happy, wholesome, normal family event. The pregnancy. Lucy couldn't do an entire 39-episode production while she was pregnant. And at that point, you never showed reruns, so this causes a problem. But Desi and Jess Oppenheimer come up with an idea. We got all those shows. We own them. They're sitting on the shelf. Why don't we just throw them on? Reruns were rating winners, created a new area for TV called syndication. Desilu went on to invent the concept of the rerun and used the profits to grow their studio. Lucy and Desi were television's first millionaires. And by the way, as far as pregnancy, Dwight Eisenhower becomes president on January 20th, 1953. Lucy gives birth to Little Ricky on the show on January 19th, the night before. Lucy gets 44 million viewers. The new president of the United States, only 29 million voters. So the pregnancy, that hurdle is overcome. The interracial marriage overcome. Oh, looking for commies. And this could have ended Lucy's career, like Philip Loeb, like Hazel Scott. She registered communist back in 1936. I intend to affiliate at the ensuing primary election with the Communist Party. And here's the red channels screaming Americans, don't patronize Reds, you could drive the Reds, and the television, radio, and Hollywood, and this track tells you how and why we must drive them out, because they were all tools of Stalin in Moscow. The blacklist involved the practice of denying employment to entertainment and industry professionals believed to be or have been communists or communist sympathizers, not just actors, but screenwriters, directors, musicians, and other entertainment professionals, and they were barred from work by the studios. People like Burt Kelton, who was the original Alice Cramden in 1951, on the Cavalcade of Stars on Dumont, the Honeymooner sketch with Jackie Gleason. She was blacklisted and replaced by Audrey Meadows. Jackie Gleason didn't want this to happen, but he had no clout at that point. He'd bring her back in the 1960s on the Honeymooner sketches as his mother-in-law, Ralph Cramden's mother-in-law. Oh, her departure based on heart problems. There's Philip Loeb, 1955. He checked himself into the Taft Hotel, Midtown Manhattan, under a false name, took a fatal dose of sleeping pills. He was accused of being a communist, couldn't work anymore. He was, of course, the co-star of the Goldbergs. McCarthyism and blackballing. September 4th, 1953, Lucy gives voluntary testimony to investigator of the House on Un-American Activities. It's her grandfather, Fred Hunt. He just wanted us to. And we just did something to please him. I didn't intend to vote that way. As I recall, I didn't. Maybe that the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, big fan of I Love Lucy, might have saved Lucy from being blacklisted. And she told the committee that, yeah, I gave my grandfather my garage and he used it to organize with his friends. And she said in her autobiography that she was a strong conservative with a Puritan streak. I'm the most conservative member of my family. For her grandfather, a progressive and free thinker, she registered as a communist. And there's Lucy and Desi after she gives the testimony, and Desi would say during an audience warm-up, the only thing read about Lucy is her hair, and even that's not legitimate. There she is, brunette. She had the hair change from brunette to redhead for the 1943 film To Barry Was a Lady. She's not naturally a redhead. And while we're going at it, being the Ricardos, I told you the problem with pregnancy, the problem with communism, and the problem here with Confidential magazine. Does Desi really love Lucy? Those three are rolled into 1 week in Being the Ricardos, the movie. Desi Arnaz was cheating on his wife, Lucille Ball, according to Confidential magazine, 1955. I knew Desi was inviting me for more than a drink, said the Babe. It's a story from the 1940s when Arnaz and Ball were separated. The Babe quoted was a prostitute on Confidential's payroll. Lucy caught colds, had crying spells, broke 2 fingers, sprained her ankle 3 times, pulled a tendon, sweated off 19 pounds, came down with a virus, went on hiatus, recovered at the beach, fainted on stage, production crew set up an oxygen tank, and then she fainted again. By 1956, she's had it, as Desi had. CBS buys the rights to the previously shown I Love Lucy program for $5 million. So they could start showing them in 1957. With that money, Lucy and Desi would purchase the RKO studio lot and rename it Desi Lou Productions. And they had shows like Andy Griffin, Mission Impossible, Hogan's Heroes, Batman, Star Trek on that lot. My Favorite Husband, the show that Lucy left to go on TV, well, it's on for 2.5 years. Joan Caulfield was the Lucy character in that show. Liz Cooper, Barry Nelson played George Cooper. The first 2 years shot at the CBS television studio, the last year at Desi Lou. And there'd be an occasional show. In 1957, after they decided they had enough, they got $2.5 million from Ford to do 5 Lucy and Desi shows. They also had the Ann Southern show on, as well as the Untouchables, and another show, the Westinghouse Desi Lou Playhouse. And that gave birth to 2 shows. Twilight Zone, The Untouchables. Lucy makes her debut as a producer with a 1959 episode of Westinghouse Desi Lou Playhouse. Here's Rod Serwing, who had his first TV venture called The Time Element as part of the Westinghouse Desi Lou show. And CBS decided it was so good that they were going to offer Rod a contract. They renamed the show The Twilight Zone. The other show was The Untouchables, and they split in 1960. See the USA, Driver Chevrolet, Dinah Shore, 1951. She made her debut on the Ed Wynn Show, and then the Bob Hope Show, and then she gets her own regular show, 15 minutes. The show was on twice a week in 1956. Chevrolet sponsored Dinah to host 2 one-hour specials, and then she has a musical variety show from 56 to 61 every Sunday night. See the USA, Driver Chevrolet. Donna Reed owned her own show. She wrote and produced some of the episodes. 1950s women were depicted, for the most part, as stay-at-home mothers. That wasn't always the case, like Armis Brooks. And they were there to cook and clean. The father of the house made decisions. The character Donna Stone expressed the desire to pursue her own career, but also asserting herself as an equal in her marriage, and assumed the role of disciplinarian and moral teacher to her children. That show would run from 1958 to 1966. This is a woman you probably don't know about. Her name, Erner Phillips. She was a radio and television writer who developed the modern soap opera. She was known as the Queen of Soaps. She introduced techniques such as ba-ba-ba-ba, the organ bridge, to give a smooth flow between scenes. I knew Eddie Layton, who did that on CBS, and I said, What was your favorite organ? He said, when the bad guy came in, bum, 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 and the cliffhanger ending to each episode. Her last show, Days of Our Lives, which came on in 1965, is still on 56 years later. Some of her shows included Today's Children on Radio Guiding Light, radio and television, Road of Life, Women in White, which was the first hospital soap opera she created, As the World Turns, Another World, Love is a Many Splendored Thing, and with Alan Chase and Ted Corday, Days of Our Lives, which is still on. Faye Emerson Show. She was on late night. She began airing on CBS October 24th, 1949 in local East Coast markets, which would be Washington, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Baltimore. The network moved the 15-minute show up. It started at 11 o'clock. In 1950, she also hosted a similar show on NBC called 15 Minutes with Faye. For about 6 months before committing to the CBS show, she was the first late-night talk show host, and this wasn't one of these fluff shows. She would talk about U.S. relations with China. Remember, China went communist in 1949, the war with Korea in 1950, nuclear arms equality for women with guests such as Frank Sinatra, Frank Lloyd Wright, Tennessee Williams, and Edith Piaf. And there also might be clowns the next night. Meet the Press. There is Martha Roundtree. The longest running show on network TV in the United States is Meet the Press. Martha Roundtree was the program's co-creator, producer, and chief booker. And she was the host and moderator in 1947, which is kind of amazing when you think of it. She eventually teamed up with Lawrence Spivak, who is the publisher and editor of the New Mercury magazine. She creates Meet the Press on TV, starts on Mutual Radio in 1945, on TV, November 6, 1947. She would leave Meet the Press in 1953 when she had too many arguments with Spivak. Pauline Frederick, 1948, she was assigned to cover the Democratic National Convention. I got in that door because in those days, the men didn't know anything more about television than women. I went to Elizabeth Arden to learn about makeup and to Bonwit Teller to learn how to dress, and I always got plenty of advice on how I should look. Management wanted me in navy colors with austere necklines. They insisted I lighten my dark brown hair. They told me to wear contact lenses instead of glasses, and they continually had my hair teased because they said it's too flat-headed. The legacy. Well, there's Betty White. Gertrude Berg survived the blacklist, but never achieved the popularity she once enjoyed. She continued in her showbiz career and won Best Actress Tony on Broadway for her performance opposite Cedric Hardwicke in The Majority of One. Unfortunately, she is totally forgotten today. You ask most people under the age of 60. They have no idea who Gertrude Berg was. Her last appearance was on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1965. Betty White's career has spanned over 7 decades. Hazel Scott's forgotten. For the most part, she's totally forgotten, but she was the first person of color to host a TV show. At the 2019 Grammy Awards, Alicia Keys paid tribute to her. I've been thinking so much about the people and the music that have inspired. I want to give a shout out to Hazel Scott because I always wanted to play two pianos. Hazel Scott fled to France in the 1950s to pursue her career. She would come back to America and would be on General Hospital and do her nightclub act. Dagmar hung around TV as a game show guest and a talk show guest in the 1950s and 60s, performed in Las Vegas shows and summer stock. She would retire to West Virginia, where she ended up living with her brother and sister-in-law. She passed away about 20 years ago. Lucille Ball. Lucille Ball. She's still around. She's still popular. A biopic was recently released. Another one's coming out in 2022. This will be a documentary with Amy Poehler producing it, done by Ron Howard's company. And there's also, of course, the radio program, which is on Sirius XM Radio, Lunch with Lucy, the shows from the mid-1960s that have been actually either beefed up or pared down to fit a format. Some of the people on those shows include Frank Sinatra, very young Barbara Streisand. Just remember, this was done in 64, 65, and 66. Carol Burnett. Faye Emerson retired from showbiz in 1963 and went to Europe. Dinah Shore had a long career. Donna Reed's show was groundbreaking. Erna Phillips' influence on soap operas continued today. Martha Roundtree's Meet the Press is the longest running show on American TV. Oddly enough, it was Lawrence Spivak, it was Tim Russert, it was David Gregory, it is Chuck Todd. There has not been a woman host since Martha Roundtree. And Pauline Frederick, she moderated a 1976 presidential debate between President Gerald Ford and the challenger Jimmy Carter. So women did have an impact. Some of the women I didn't mention from those days include Gail Storm, of course, who was on My Little Margie, and Eve Arden, who was on Our Miss Brooks. And there were shows like I Remember Mama. But these were the pioneers. These were the ones who made the difference. And unfortunately, other than Betty White, most have been forgotten and are just in history books right now, or in some cases videotaped. I want to thank you for joining me today. Any questions, any comments? I'm all ears. Anybody have anything to say?